Then I would say let's start, if you're ready.
Sure.
I would like to start with a very fundamental question. Are we as society prepared for the moral and ethical consequences of machine intelligence?
Probably not. Gosh. It's immensely challenging to respond to technological developments, particularly because they're coming so quickly. And in many ways they're a little bit random, or they're a little bit unexpected at times. For example, most experts in the AI space did not expect Go to be a sort of solved problem by computers for another maybe 10 years at least. And so there's a lot of very surprising developments that have caught some people off guard. Furthermore, the dirty secret of machine intelligence is that in many ways, nobody really knows what they're doing. A lot of it is very much just experimentation. It's throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. We're at the point where, to put it in a historical perspective, where we are shifting from alchemy to chemistry, right? Alchemy was basically just about boiling things up and seeing what happened. Chemistry, you have lots of models, and you begin to understand why certain things do certain phenomena. But there is a sort of changeover period where people invented models of how the world works on a chemical level. Things like phlogiston theory, which was a theory that was around for maybe, a decade or two, which was trying to explain why things burn. And this was before Joseph Priestley discovered oxygen, for example. We're kind of at that point. We have a few phlogiston theories of machine learning, things like the manifold hypothesis, but we don't really know how these things work or why. We are at the beginning of creating a good model and a good objective understanding of how these things work. And what that means is that we've seen examples of people deciding to try using a sigmoid function, and then, oh, that works quite well. Oh, now we can go a few deeper layers. Oh, great. Oh, it turns out that throwing lots of data at these things makes them surprisingly very effective. Oh, okay. And a lot of the developments have been entirely stumbled upon with very little theory or even hypotheses to guide them. And what that means is that tomorrow somebody could discover an advancement in this space, in this space that would, create orders of magnitude more efficiency. It might be just around the corner. It might take another 20 years for that development to arise. And so that makes it all the more difficult to predict what's going to happen. In terms of the morality and ethics of machines, that's an immense challenge. Firstly, integrating these technologies into our society is a big challenge. These systems are little optimization genies, right? They can create all kinds of amazing optimizations or amazing generated content. And that means that anything can be faked, anything can be counterfeited. And sometimes life is at its best when it isn't necessarily too optimized, when we take time to smell the roses, so to speak. And we're already starting to see effects upon our society and culture from AI. Machines are optimized for engagement often, and sometimes the strongest engagement is outrage. And so, if they figure out that pushing people's buttons gets more shares, then that's what they will tend to do. And over the last 10 years or so, we've seen across the globe a very strong polarization of our culture of people into ideological camps, which are increasingly entrenched and increasingly distant from each other. And it used to be that most people, most of the time, could mostly agree on what was right and wrong, and you know, they thought, well, those people might be naive, but you know, maybe they'll grow out of it, right? But today, people are increasingly starting to think of the other camp or the other ideologies as being fundamentally bad people. And so people are starting to disengage with each other. And that's damaging the fabric of our society in a very profound way, and I find that very, very disconcerting indeed. We're also starting to see our culture being damaged in other ways as well. Due to the amount of content which is uploaded to YouTube, right? Days of content every minute. It's almost impossible to raise an army of human beings in sufficient numbers to actually moderate that kind of content. And so a lot of it has just had to fall on algorithms. Unfortunately, a lot of those algorithmic decisions aren't very good ones. And a lot of content which is quite benign ends up being flagged or demonetized for very mysterious reasons which aren't explained to anyone. And, you know, entire channels of content can be deleted overnight on a whim, with very little oversight, with very little ability to get redress, you know, to get a voice of reason involved to try to put things right. And I think that's a problem that's only going to get worse as more of these algorithms get used in our society in different ways. And I think it's very dangerous because it can lead to chilling effects, where people are afraid to say something, not because maybe a human might misunderstand them, although increasingly in this ideological, entrenched world, that is also a factor. But even worse is, what if a stupid algorithm like picks 3 words out of a paragraph and just decides that you're, you know, trolling, or you're creating fake news or some sort of thing like that. And the next thing you know, you've been mysteriously downvoted or shadow banned, and you know, you're talking to an empty room, although you may not even see the walls. And I think that can be maddening. I mean, that's those kinds of systems can literally drive people insane if they suspect that something has it in for them, but they can't prove it, and there's no way to know for sure. And I have deep fears about what that will do for our society. So those are some of the issues of morals and ethics of how computers are used.
But you still consider yourself an optimist, right? Because all those points you raised, of course, are some valid points, and they sound a bit scary. How can you still stay optimistic?
There are very major challenges to be overcome. I think we still have an opportunity to overcome them, but it is going to be a challenge. 30 years ago, we managed to get the entire world to coordinate on CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. And in just a few short years, everybody decided, okay, we're screwing up the ozone layer, let's stop doing that, okay? And everybody coordinated, and everybody has more or less behaved on that. That's an amazing achievement. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm a little bit optimistic that we might find some of the solutions on this, if we can kind of come together as a global community to agree best practices and try to get everyone to behave. I think optimism, a cautious, pragmatic optimism, is an essential ingredient in daily life and in engineering. Because it's only by exercising the quality of optimism that you can reach into an imagined better future, and figure out how to pull it back into the present. And if all you can see in the future is horrible situations and dystopias, that tends to be a sort of paralyzing effect. We're like, oh no, this is terrible, and we sort of end up panicking, you know? And as everyone knows, you know, if you're in a bad situation, like you're drowning in quicksand slowly, panicking is the worst thing you can do. And so staying cautiously optimistic, keeping your head, and figuring out the best way to slowly move forward is perhaps the way to get out of a sticky situation. And so I try to make people aware of the challenges, but also aware of some of the many possibilities there are. The flip side of these dangerous situations is that we equally have an opportunity to have machines that guide us and that help us to be better human beings, that help us to have greater power and efficacy in the world, and more fulfillment, and find greater meaning in life. There is an emerging domain called machine ethics. It's part of a broader area of study called value alignment, or AI alignment. It's about teaching machines how to understand human preferences, how to understand how humans tend to interact in nice ways. Basically, ensuring that machines are aligned on human goals, and also beginning to socialize machines so that they know how to behave in polite society. There are some very interesting potential approaches, algorithms using things like various forms of inverse reinforcement learning, where machines look at us and how we interact and sort of try to figure out the rules without being explicitly told, just by sort of watching how other people function. In many ways, human beings learn socialization in similar ways, you know. In an unfamiliar culture, you kind of wait for other people to start, you know, doing something, or how to, you know, greet someone, or which fork to use with your salad, you know. We kind of learn in that way sometimes, and I think there are great opportunities for machines to learn about us in similar ways. For me, I've spotted a bit of a missing component in making all of this work, and that is data. One of the reasons why machine intelligence has taken off in recent years is because we have very rich data sets, that's sets of experiences about the world for machines to learn from. We have lots and lots of data, a huge increase in the amount of data in the world today, thanks to the internet, thanks to new layers of information that machines can learn from. We've moved from a web of text and a few low-resolution pictures to a world of video, to a world of location and health data, etc. And all of this can be used to train machines and get them to understand how our world is and why it works the way it does. A few years ago, there was a particularly important data set that was released by a professor called Fei Li and her team. And this data set, ImageNet, was a corpus of information about objects, whether it's buses or cows or teddy bears or tables, so that machines could begin to recognize objects in the world. Now, the data itself was extremely useful for training things like convolutional neural networks, these revolutionary new technologies for machine vision. But more than that, it was a benchmarking system, because you could test one approach versus another, and you could test them in different situations. And that led to a very rapid increase over just a few years in this space. I would like to do something similar for teaching machines about how to behave in nice ways, right? A data set of pro-social human behaviors to teach machines about kindness, about congeniality, politeness, and manners. When we think of young children, often we don't teach them right and wrong so much as we teach them, you know, we're in polite company, please be quiet. You know, this is a quiet place, please, you know. We teach them simple social graces before we teach them right and wrong. And in many ways, manners, good manners, are the mother of morality in a sense, right? They're sort of the foundational layer. And so going on that assumption, we're trying to teach machines basic social rules like, you know, it's not nice to stare at people, be quiet in a church or museum, and, you know, if you see someone drop something that looks important like their wallet, alert them. These sorts of simple rules. The things that we ideally would like to teach a 6-year-old child, a well-raised 6-year-old child, you know, to know and to understand. And if we can do that, then we can sort of iterate into more complex things. But the important thing will be that we will have some information that we can use to begin to benchmark these different approaches. Because otherwise it's going to take another 20 years to teach machines about human society and how to behave in ways that we would prefer. There's lots of ideas out there, but until the data arrives, we can't do anything with it. And so that's why I've co-founded a non-profit called EthicsNet, which is trying to teach the world, trying to create a data set of pro-social behaviors, which has been annotated or labeled by people from all across the world, every different culture and creed, and just sort of invite everyone to the table, no matter who, and say, come on then, please put your values here, and we'll begin to make sense of it. And so we can find the commonalities between different values, but we can also create little nuances or flavors of behavior that might be more suitable to specific cultures or specific situations.
When was the first time when you realized, okay, machine learning, artificial intelligence, those are not just cool technologies, but they have much broader implications, and I want to go more into the ethical considerations and not just be an entrepreneur? When was that? Was it early on, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I kind of had a background and an interest in computer science, and I wanted to use technology in a social way. And I happened to see a documentary on people working in these textile factories in Asia, these sweatshops. And they were working with these very repetitive motions, like robots. And I had a deep, visceral reaction to that. I thought, goodness, there's 86 billion neurons there. There's people, and they're being used like machines. And they're not using any of their creative capacity, you know, they're kind of zoned out, almost in a trance. And I thought, there must be a way to help people like that to use more of their creative capacities and to be a little more independent. And I reasoned that if there was a market for mass customized clothing, then maybe they could create this customized clothing and earn 5 times more income and have more opportunities to be independent in a network rather than, you know, in somebody's factory. They could use the same skills but in a different way, a way that would have more economic impact. However, the missing component was capturing the measurements of people in an easy way. It's very subjective to measure yourself. Normally you need someone to help you, and it's not an easy thing to do. I was observing, this is around 2010 or so, that smartphones were beginning to take off. That smartphone cameras were getting very powerful, and we were starting to see the first GPUs really in smartphones that could do some quite advanced graphics and such. And I knew that, you know, after a certain number of hardware revisions, smartphones would begin to get very, very capable in their vision abilities. And so I thought it must be possible to use machine vision technologies to capture body measurements, just using a 2D image. And at the time, everyone thought we were crazy. This idea of being able to capture something 3D from 2D seemed impossible.
But it worked.
It worked, yes, but it was a lot of playing detective, sort of tracing down little ideas and sort of experimenting and seeing what worked. But it was also good timing, because right around the time when we were starting to begin to implement this was when we were just having this revolution in deep neural networks. We're starting to see for the first time the power of these machine vision technologies and data sets like ImageNet which could power them. And so that enabled us to do very powerful image segmentation techniques to cut people out of the background, and to put these technologies directly on the smartphone rather than having to send them to the cloud to be processed first. So that's what took me into machine vision, and getting into machine vision got me into machine intelligence, because a lot of the latest techniques in machine vision were very heavily dependent on things like deep neural networks and convolutional neural networks. Around 2013, I went and studied at Singularity University in their Global Solutions program, and then shortly thereafter I joined the faculty. Whilst I was out there, I met a whole bunch of people that were very concerned about AI, that were trying to formulate solutions that might not even be used for another 30 years, but they were concentrating on it very much. And in many ways they befriended me. And in wanting to honor their friendship, I started to think about this and see, well, I might have some ideas, maybe I can help. And one of the observations that I noticed was that you're going to need a good data set if you're going to test these different approaches. Like, it doesn't matter which one works. Without data, you can't deploy it. So that, to me, would seem to be an important thing to concentrate on. And although I was trying to, convince people that this would be an obvious thing to be working on, it seemed to fall on deaf ears. And so I decided, I suppose I better give it a shot myself. And so that's what's taken me on this path today.
Okay. Just for understanding, you are still at the company?
Quanticore, which was Poikos, it's now Quanticore. Yes, I'm a co-founder of that company, and I've brought on board a wonderful new CEO, so that's freed up a lot of my time for things like EthicsNet.
So it's fair to say that you spent most of your time on machine intelligence and its implications,
yes.
But you're still at the company.
I continue to advise and help out.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I also think you are quite optimistic on blockchain technology. Could you elaborate a little bit?
Yes. Human beings have been using different forms of encryption for a very, very long time. The ancient Sumerians had a sort of a token and crypto solution 5,000 years ago. And they would put these little tokens, these little things that represented numbers or quantities, inside a clay ball, and then wrap the clay ball in some like tar paper. And that meant that you could keep your message secret, but you could also be sure that it hadn't been cracked open for people to see, and the tokens wouldn't get lost and that sort of thing. And it's funny that, 5,000 years later, we find a digital approach of doing something a little bit similar. But these are age-old problems. One of the greatest developments of the early Renaissance was the invention of double entry accounting. And it was invented in a couple of different places around sort of the 10th, 12th centuries, around that time. But it didn't really take off until a Franciscan friar called Father Luca Pacioli was inspired by this aesthetic of as above, so below, this sort of like divine mirror of the world. And so he thought that, you know, it would be a good thing if there was a mirror of books. So you would have an entry in one place and a corresponding entry in another. And although it seems very dry, this development of double entry accounting, it actually enabled global trade in ways that were not possible before. If you had a ship at sea and you lost the books, that's it, all those records are gone. But with double entry, you could recreate the books even if they had been lost. It made fraud a lot more difficult, and so that enabled banking practices. And so you had the first banking cartels, your Medicis and later the Rothschilds and so forth, which otherwise, you know, would not have been possible. You had things like the Templar Bank, where people could kind of deposit money in one place and pick it up somewhere else, a little bit like a traveler's check in the 20th century. And none of this would have been possible if we didn't have distributed ledgers, you see? Now, if we fast forward a little bit to around 1685 or so, thereabouts, the Ottomans invaded Vienna for the second time, and they were repulsed. They went home in defeat, but they left behind something remarkable, an amazing substance, coffee. And, you know, some enterprising folks took that coffee and opened the first coffee house in Vienna. And, you know, to this day, Viennese coffee houses have a very long and deep tradition. And that tradition is one where people can come together and learn about the world, because there's all these periodicals and magazines you can go and take, and it's a nice, quiet environment suitable for an intellectual conversation. And so instead of, you know, drunk people meeting in the local pub and, you know, people could have an enlightened conversation. And coffee, in many ways, helped to construct the Enlightenment, right? Because these were forums where people could share ideas in a safe way that was relatively private. And so from that enabled new forms of coordination which were more sophisticated. From the first coffee houses, we saw the emergence of the first insurance companies like Lloyd's of London. We saw the emergence of the first joint stock companies, the VOC, etc. The first stock exchange in Amsterdam grew out of a coffee house. And in many ways, it was this that enabled the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution wasn't so much about steam. The ancient Greeks had steam engines, primitive ones. They could have had an Industrial Revolution from a technological perspective, but not from a social perspective. They did not yet have the social technologies required to increase the level of complexity in their society, because they didn't have these trust-building mechanisms and these institutions that help to create trust. If you lose your ship, you don't necessarily lose your entire lifestyle if you're insured. That builds trust, that builds security. In a joint stock company, shareholders are owed information by the commanders of that company, right? And so they have some security that people aren't just going to take their money and disappear, and that they will have a say in how the company is organized. All of these things build trust. Trust enables complexity. Greater complexity enabled the Industrial Revolution. Today, we have amazing new technologies built on triple entry ledger systems. These triple entry ledger technologies mean that we can build trust. We can use these as layers of trust building mechanisms to augment our existing institutions in a way that is decentralized, where there is in theory no single point of failure and no single point of control or corruption of that trust building mechanism. And it means that we can franchise trust to parts of the world that don't have very good trust building infrastructure, you know? Not everywhere in the world has very efficient government or very trustworthy government. And so these technologies enable us to give a firmer foundation to the social fabric in many parts of the world where trust is not necessarily very strong. This is a very good thing not only for commerce, but also for human happiness, because there is no stronger correlation in society when you look at human happiness than trust. Trust and happiness go hand in hand, even when you control for things like GDP, you know? Even if you're poor, if you believe that your neighbor generally has your best interests in their hearts, all things being equal, you will tend to be happy. You will be secure, even if you're poor. And so anything that we can use to build more trust in society will typically trend towards making people more happy. But it also means that we can enable new forms of societal complexity, right? We can create new ways of organizing people and capital and values in ways that enable a much greater level of complex societal function. If we're very lucky and if we don't screw it up, we might see something like another industrial revolution built upon these kinds of technologies, right? Because the last one, when we enabled new forms of complexity, that was almost like a singularity itself in terms of the increase, in terms of GDP, in terms of people's access to food, et cetera, et cetera. It was, you know, everything before the Industrial Revolution was terrible, and then it got a lot better. Now we're still extending the benefits of that to the rest of the world, but, you know, we have increasingly managed to do that ever since. However, there is a flip side, of course. Today, global GDP is something like 80 trillion or so. But what isn't on the balance sheet is all of the externalities that we've created, right? Externalities in economic terms are when one does something that affects an unrelated third party, things like pollution, right? Although, you know, world GDP may be 80 trillion, there are quadrillions of unfunded externalities which aren't on the balance sheet, right? Species destroyed, populations enslaved, all kinds of horrible things which have not been accounted for. And in certain ways, we've kind of cheated our way into this nice, comfortable life, for some of us anyway, by not paying for our externalities. Now, typically, government, good government that actually tries to govern well, is principally focused on the management and accounting of externalities, right? But it's generally done ex post facto, after the fact. somebody creates a huge mess, and then somebody says, "Ooh, that's very naughty, you have to pay a fine," right? However, as these machine ethics technologies get more sophisticated, as we are able to intertwine them with machine economics technologies, that's things like distributed ledger technology, and machine intelligence to give us the sort of the smarts to connect all of these things together and understand how one thing affects something else. We will, in the 2020s and 2030s, be able to start accounting for externalities in society for the very first time. That means that we can include externalities in pricing mechanisms to make people pay for them at the point of purchase, not after the fact. And so that means that products or services that don't create so many externalities in the world will, all things being equal, be a little bit cheaper. And so we can create economic incentives to be kinder to people and planet whilst still maintaining profit. And so I believe that's how we're going to move past this sort of socialist versus capitalist kind of dichotomy. We can have our free markets, we can have our cake and eat it, so long as we do the accounting, right? We do the accounting of externalities. And that's what these distributed ledger technologies are going to enable with machine ethics and machine intelligence, the confluence of the three together, right? Good accounting practices.
I think you once mentioned that those technologies could even replace states as monopolies of force.
Possibly, yes.
In the distant future?
Possibly, yes. I think that's where we are likely to get towards at some point. There's lots of people out there that's states are bad, smash the state, whatever. There are good states and there are not so good states, and states exist for a reason. If we look at the very first cities in the world, if we look at towns rather than cities, really, such as Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, these cities don't look like modern cities at all. They don't even have the same layout. They're more like a beehive. They are little square dwellings, all sort of built on top of each other. And there's no streets. And there's no public buildings either. There's no plazas, there's no temples, there's no palaces. All buildings are identical. And from the archaeological record, we see that people started to live in these kinds of conurbations for a while. And then they stopped for a period of about 800 years. They gave up living in this way and they went back to living in very small villages and little huts and things. And when we next see cities, they're very different. We next see the first, cities like Uruk and Babylon. There you've got streets, you've got boulevards, you've got big temples and workshops, you've got industrial areas, commercial areas. On a functional level, it's not too dissimilar from modern cities, at least in its general layout and how people, have their different divisions of labor and that sort of thing. So what was the difference, and why did people abandon cities for a time? If you think about it, if you're a nomad, moving around from place to place, having property is kind of a white elephant. Because whatever it is that you own, you have to take it with you. And so these were very egalitarian societies where, you know, no one person had much more than anyone else. And then these people started living together and they started farming. And the thing about farming is that it enables you to turn 1x of effort into 10x of output. And so some people got a little bit luckier with their farming than others. And so they were able to have more stuff and have more wealth than others. And it seems to me that that created tension in society, right? You know, people started to get jealous of each other. And people started to worry about keeping their stuff, because if their back was turned, somebody could come and take it. And I think that's where states started to form. You know, that you got a couple of heavies to mind your stuff and protect your clan. And it was only the invention of that sort of centralization of power that enabled cities in their modern form. That's why the first cities failed. They hadn't developed this social technology yet. 10,000 years later, we still have the same technology, the same centralization of power, the same monopoly of force. And that's what generally governs the world. And it enables society as we know it, so that's not a bad thing. But I do believe that the technologies that we are now developing may enable us to move past monopolies of force and into something that is perhaps a little more egalitarian again, paradoxically, and towards outcomes which are more non-zero sum, you know, where it's less about winning and losing and it's more about trade-offs. And, you know, generally speaking, things like trade enable non-zero sum outcomes. You know, if I want your money more than you want those sausages, then we're both better off if we trade. And I think as we develop more sophisticated trading mechanisms due to things like machine economics technologies, we can begin to trade all kinds of things. We can trade externalities. We can even pay people to follow a certain morality or make a certain value call on something. We can begin to incentivize all kinds of nice behaviors without needing to use the stick. We can use the carrot instead.
The potential of distributed ledger technologies and blockchain technologies seems enormous, but on the other hand, it also seems a quite bumpy road to implement it, because if I look at cryptocurrencies today, it's ironic that the technology aims to solve the trust problem, but on the other hand, you have scams, you have people losing much of money in ICOs, and so on. How do you assess that?
Well, it's very much a Wild West at the moment. And in a Wild West environment, strangely enough, one of the most important aspects of trust in this space is actually knowing other people, right? Who are the advisors of your crypto company? You know, do you have some good names in there? Are they actually involved in your company? You know, these are the things that people want to verify, along with having a good poke at your white paper. Because most people aren't really able to dig into the mathematics. Or even if they are, you know, there's a lot of code to be vetted, and that code can be revised at any time. So really, still, strangely enough, even in the crypto world, so much of trust is just built on personal reputation. We are at an early stage. I think that machine economics technologies are only going to really take off when they begin to get married with machine intelligence and machine ethics. That's what's going to enable a new magic form of enabling societal complexity in the 2020s. The first industrial revolution was about augmenting muscle, the muscle of beasts of burden, the muscle of human beings, motive power. In the second industrial revolution, say let's say the informational revolution, was about augmenting our minds. Oh, I've been bitten by something. Was about augmenting, augmenting our cognition, enabling us to do all kinds of complex information processing and to remember things that our brains would find very difficult to do so. That was what computers were initially developed for. But we're coming to another revolution, an augmentation of what I call the human heart and soul. Augmenting our ability to make good moral judgments about things. Augmenting our ability to understand how an action that we take has an effect on others. Giving us suggestions of nicer ways of engaging with something, you know? Do you really want to send that angry message to that person? You know, perhaps you might wish to reformulate that retort to someone. You know, here is a product that might even suit your needs better, and it's, you know, it's cheaper and it's kinder to the environment. What do you think? You know, perhaps these kinds of technologies, when they begin to map human values and map who we are deep in our core, they might help us to build relationships with people that we otherwise might miss out on. Often, when people get together, it's not people that are exactly the same, it's the people that complement each other, right? The masculine and the feminine, the introvert, the extrovert, the nerd and the jock, the people who have different skills and talents and possibly even worldviews, but they share similar values. You see? So they are similar and yet different. In your town, you may have 100 potential besties out there. But unless you have an opportunity to meet them, grab a little coffee with them, get to know them, you pass like ships in the night and never see each other, except, you know, to, tip your hat at them. And I think these technologies can help us to find those people that are most like us. As Timothy Leary said, find the others. As machines can help us to find the others. And in a world where people are increasingly feeling isolated, during the 1980s, statistically, many of us could count on 3 or 4 close friends. And today, people increasingly report only having 1 or 0 close friends. We live in a world of incredible abundance, resources and safety and opportunities. And yet increasingly people are feeling disconnected from each other, from themselves, from spirituality and nature. And it's my hope that augmenting the human heart and soul might help us to solve for those higher problems in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to help us to find love and belonging, to build self-esteem, to get us towards self-actualization. There are very few truly self-actualized human beings on this planet, and I think that's a crying shame. Because when a human being is truly self-actualized, they are unstoppable. And so that's what I would like to see us build in the 2020s and beyond. An industrialization of not just basic human needs, but the entire human arete, the human excellence, the joy of being human. I would like to see that begin to be industrialized, so that everyone on this planet has an opportunity to be a self-actualized human being.
So you have a lot of visions for the future, how society could change, how what aspects are important to deal with new technologies, and you invest your time in understanding and creating the future.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, you have our leaders in society, in politics, who do not really seem to be that aware of these possibilities. How do you deal with that?
And so one of the challenges of regulation is that it is generally done in the rear view mirror, in hindsight, right? A challenge appears, you do your best to try to respond to it. And unfortunately, with technology advancing at such a rate, and also with social change happening quite quickly at the moment, and increasingly quickly, it can be very difficult to keep up. It can be very difficult to regulate in a proactive way and not a reactive way. And I think that's one of the reasons why principles are so important. Because principles are the things that we decide in advance of a situation. And so when we come to that situation, we have an immediate heuristic of how to respond. We don't panic. And we know what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, right? And so we don't, if we have sound principles in advance of a dilemma, we're much less likely to accidentally make a sketchy decision, you know? And so I think that's one of the reasons why having good principles is very important.
But our principles and values are often not that consistent. Isn't that the case? You mentioned I heard you mention that if machines learn our values and they would implement those values very consistently, more consistent than we do, it could actually be a danger, because machines might interpret values very consistent, and we as humans are more gray areas, not only black and white.
It's true, in a sense. We might even engineer machines that on some levels, on some occasions, are more moral than the average human being. There was a psychologist called Lawrence Kohlberg who reckoned that there were about 6 different layers of moral understanding. It's not about the decision that you make, it's rather the reason why you make that decision. And the earliest levels are about, don't do that thing because you'll get punished. And then later levels are about, be loyal to your family and your friends and your clan, or this is against the law, or it's against religious doctrine, or that sort of thing. And of the 6 levels, Kohlberg reckoned that most people get to about level 4 or so before they pass on. And, a few people manage to get a little bit beyond that. And so perhaps the benchmark of average human morality isn't set that high. Most people are generally not aspiring to be angels. They are aspiring to sort of cover their ass. They are looking at what other people are doing and trying to be as approximately as moral as they are, right? Am I keeping up with the Joneses morally? Can somebody call me out for not being moral? Or am I kind of covering my butt? Now, if there's machines in the mix, and machines are helping to suggest potential solutions that might be a little bit more moral than many people are, find it easy to reason to that level, then perhaps machines might add to this social cognition of morality, that machines might help to sort of tweak and nudge us in a nicer direction. That's my hope anyway. Although, of course, given how algorithms can also take us in ways that can be very quietly oppressive. It remains to be seen how that will play out. People will readily rebel against a human tyrant, an oppressor that they can point at. But they don't tend to rebel against repressive systems. They tend to sort of shrug and accept it, and this is the way things work. Well, okay, fine. And that's one of the reasons why I would like to see these implemented in a good way and not in a quietly tyrannical way.
My final question is about the relationship between Europe and the US and China, because media always portrays the race in AI between China and the US. And you are European, you live in Europe. What do you think is the place that Europe has in adopting the new technologies in the context of the US and China being ahead?
I think Europe has a phenomenal advantage with these new technologies. Although things might seem to be done very quickly in China or Silicon Valley, you know, they think fast in China, they think big in Silicon Valley. But Europe is, in many ways, dare I say, at the cradle of civilization. There is a deep well of culture and intellect and moral awareness in our wonderful continent. We have incredible beauty, natural beauty, but also, you know, beautiful architecture, beautiful artwork. I think as we begin to introduce machines to our culture, as we begin to teach these naive little agents about society and how to socialize them, like young children in a sense, Europe has a uniquely positioned opportunity to be the leader in bringing culture and ethics into machines, given our long heritage of developing these kinds of technologies.
So you never thought about going to the Silicon Valley for migrating there? You want to stay in Europe?
I've spent a great deal of time out in Silicon Valley, and I appreciate many of the unique social groups that they have out there. And people certainly do think very blue sky, which is very refreshing. It's a bold way of thinking. Conversely, if you go to Shenzhen or somewhere, everything moves at such a breakneck pace. It's terrifying, you know. You propose an idea and 3 days later there's a prototype on your desk, which is mind-blowing. In Europe, we don't necessarily think so big or so fast, but we think deep. We tend to think more holistically. We tend to understand how things connect, how one thing might reflect against another. We have a deep and profound understanding of history, because we have a lot of history, long histories of very good and very bad things which have happened on this continent. And that gives us a sort of slightly cautious way of dealing with the world. But I think a little bit of caution and forethought is going to be an essential ingredient if we are going to do this right. So I think that Europe has a fantastic opportunity to be the moral and cultural leader of this AI wave, especially in conjunction with machine economics and machine ethics technologies.
Okay, well, that sounds optimistic. So thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, Dominik.
It's very, very interesting.
Thank you.